Hello and welcome to Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre Live. This is a joint event with the Edinburgh Jewish Literary Society. I'm David Neville, and tonight I'll be in conversation with the poet David Bleiman. We're going to hear extracts from his work and the background to some of his poems. After a career as a trade union official, David started writing poetry in his 60s. The Trebbler's Tale, written in the part-excavated, largely reimagined dialect of Scots Yiddish, won him the Sangshaw Prize for Scots Poetry in 2020. David's first pamphlet, The Kilt of Many Colours, was published in 2021. It is a multilingual exploration of Jewish history and heritage in English, Scots, Spanish, and a little Yiddish. His second pamphlet, published in 2022, was called Gathering Light, a Cramond Causeway, and views the world and the stars from David's Edinburgh estuarine suburb at the edge of the city. Widely published locally and nationally, David was in 2022 admitted to the Scottish Poetry Library online guide to Scottish poets. So, David, welcome. You didn't start writing poetry until your 60s. Had you always wanted to write poetry, but never found the time?
To be honest, no. I mean, I had written occasional family poems. I have one, for example, that I wrote for my mother's 80th birthday, which is a while ago, and but just a few odd poems. And then I kind of caught the bug in my mid-60s, which is rather late, but not too late to start writing poetry.
So this evening we're going to hear some of your poems and what you might call the backstory, how these poems came about. So to begin at the beginning, the first poem, Reclaim the Name, is drawn on some of your earliest memories. Perhaps you can read the poem and also tell us how it came about.
So I have very few memories from early childhood, but one memory that I have when I was about 5 years old in Cape Town in South Africa is sitting on the floor probably in my grandparents' house and sitting at the kind of feet of my granny, who by that stage, although she'd been an amateur opera singer in Vienna and a very glamorous young lady, by that stage she was sort of semi-disabled and she was a chain smoker. And so she tried to teach me how to blow smoke rings. She could blow the most perfect smoke rings. And I remember her shouting out to my grandfather and his response. And that's one of my first memories. So shall I read this now?
Yes, please.
Reclaim the Name. 5 perfect smoke rings scudding out the door. Granny is coughing and shouts to the wall, Adolf, I want a glass of water. Gretel, I'm coming, sounds soft down the hall. I was 5 years old. What's in a name? Franz and Joseph topped the list of names for boys where grandfather was born. In that empire of the nationalities, he learned to master many tongues. German at high school in Lemberg, Hebrew in his grandpa's shul in the shtetl, Yiddish with the girls in mama's kitchen, Polish bringing in the harvest on father's farm and facing pistols in the pogrom's spoil, Russian as the land changed hands, English for banking and exile in Cape Town, patrolling on Boys Drive above the cliffs, scanning the ocean for U-boats. No grandson now can bear your name of shame, but here you are in uniform, stooped and proud, the only Jewish Adolf in the Musenberg Home Guard.
Tell us a bit about where that poem started. What was the first bit of inspiration?
I mean, I've often joked about how Adolf was quite a good name for a Jewish boy in 1896 when my grandfather was born. There was nothing wrong with the name for many Jewish Adolfs. but interestingly, my grandfather never changed his name. And so, you know, we thought nothing of the fact that he was Adolf. So it started, I think, started with that. And also an interesting thing happened. I mean, Muizenberg or Duisenberg, as it was sometimes jokingly called, was a sort of seaside Jewish suburb of Cape Town, and there was a sort of tour of photos of Muizenberg, and my mother and I and others of the family visited this exhibition in Golders Green, and to our surprise, there in one of the photos, and it was a photo of the Muizenberg Home Guard from the Second World War. There we saw my grandfather proudly posed as part of the Muizenberg Home Guard.
That's quite a surprise.
Yes, extraordinary.
Yeah. So your grandparents, am I right in thinking they moved from Vienna to?
They did.
To Cape Town.
They left Vienna in 1926.
Then went to Cape Town and then to London, which is where
they stayed in Cape Town, and my parents brought us to London in 1960.
Right.
When I was 6 years old.
So, I mean, just going back to the poem, it seems, you know, from an early age, the sounds you were hearing were a rich texture of language. Do you think that was the beginning of stirring your interest in many different languages?
I think because of the experiences I had, it seemed quite normal for me to, you know, to be able to speak different languages. My grandfather came over to London for my bar mitzvah in 1966, and we lived in East Finchley, and there was a Polish origin family next door to us. And one day I went out into the back garden, and my grandfather was talking over the fence in Polish to the father of the house, and I mean, these were quite extraordinary things to sort of to see, you know. But there was another time when we were on a family holiday in Paris, and at the Louvre, my dad started speaking in Yiddish to a museum attendant. So this kind of thing happened, and maybe that is why I'm comfortable with different languages.
And through your kind of childhood and growing up, were you picking up and retaining Yiddish or words from other languages?
I think more than I realized. One of the interesting things is when you sort of, I think one thing that poets do is it's a kind of curation of your life, and it's sort of a harvesting one's memories and so forth. And I found that I knew far more Yiddish words than I realized, and they sort of come out of your memory, and you sort of dredge them out of your memory, and there's quite a lot of Yiddish.
The next poem,
and sorry, I should say, and German as well, because German. Growing up, you know, coming from Vienna, and from a very educated background, my grandparents really spoke German, probably more than they spoke Yiddish.
Right, and that's a good link to our next poem, which kind of shows how something in the present and something from your past can influence what you write. Now, obviously, you've mentioned the German that you heard being speaking in your house, but I think Brexit was the trigger for this next poem.
Well, after Brexit, a very unusual thing happened, and quite a sort of chilling thing in some ways, which is German Jews who had fled Germany in the 1930s, or their children or grandchildren, started to exercise their right of return, at least to the point of applying for German passports. I don't know how many actually went back to Germany, but it seemed that after Brexit, Germany had become a more enlightened nation than Britain, which had been the sort of the place of exile, and so that got me thinking, and I started to write a poem. But as I wrote the poem, it turned more and more into my own kind of love story with Germany, where I went for my gap year in 1971, age 17, and I think anywhere you go, age 17, away from home, you're going to have an experience that's quite significant in your life. And certainly, my experience in Berlin was very a transforming experience. My parents used to say that I came back a somewhat different person.
And an interesting choice for your gap year. How did that come about, and what did your parents or your family think of you choosing Germany?
Okay, so I was going to be a scientist, allegedly. I'd been interested in astronomy and so forth, and that didn't work out for me when maths occurred and was required for science. So I took a different path. But at the stage that they thought I was going to be a scientist, my parents encouraged me to learn German because they thought I'd be able to read scientific papers in German. So I did German at school rather than Latin, which I think was the alternative choice. And then there was this project or program to get gap year English, I think it was exclusively English kids to go to Berlin. Berlin at the time was very short of labor. West Berlin, of course, was very short of labor. So I went on this exchange, which involved me working in a department store in West Berlin in 1971.
So your family were quite happy that you should go back to?
My mum and dad were happy about it, I think. Otherwise, I don't think they'd have encouraged me. But other members of the family less so. And particularly, so I was 7 months in Berlin, and then on the way back to Britain, I sort of stopped off in Israel to stay with my uncle Chaim, my great uncle Chaim, who was of the founding generation. And I spent about 5 weeks in Israel. Chaim was not chuffed that I had chosen to spend 7 months in Germany and 5 weeks in Israel. As a 17-year-old, I had little patience or understanding of his feelings. But now, of course, I wish I had been able to talk to Chaim about it.
And well, let's hear the poem, because I think the poem is an interesting reflection on your feelings now, I suppose.
Auf Wiedersehen. The letters from your Litvak cousins lost. Their shoebox home fades blue to dusty grey in memory. But I recall the postmarks up to 1941 and how you wouldn't buy a Volkswagen, could never forgive the folk who never knew. I know you felt a silent fury when I spent my gap year in Berlin. What was it pulled me back into the pain? Oh, I wish you were here and we'd talk it through. A pebble on your grave, rest on, forgive me when I go. I can be German again, not from the ashes and the birchwood, not from the acrid smoke, but from the shifting shadows of the smoke and the moving pools of sunlight, wet on the clearing grass. I long to be German again, like a boatman entranced on the Rhine, not by the blonde who is combing her hair, but a song I can't shift from my head. Let me call this feeling Heimweh, for something Heine said. I will be German again, not with the veteran's Iron Cross, not with my Stammtisch and Stein, but alone in the past where my records spin, rescued from rupture of crystal and blood, played out by exile and loss. And when I return to my German home, I'll wear with pride the yellow patch and gently take the needle to the dusty groove, to the Blue Angel, where the Weintraubs play, every night when Marlene sings from a disc in a darkened room.
It's a very moving poem, and it brings up kind of memories or visions of a culture that was lost or almost completely lost? Was that there when you were thinking of writing this poem, or in the
Yes, I
writing?
mean, I collect 78 RPM records, as you know, and I have a number of records from the Weimar period. And in the Weimar period, the German cultural life was very Jewish. You know, the Jews were completely integrated and played a leading role. So the film The Blue Angel, which I think dates from about 1929, in The Blue Angel, Friedrich Holländer was the composer of the famous songs like Falling in Love Again, which may be familiar, which Marlene Dietrich sang. And the Weintraub Syncopators, the jazz band in the background, some of them, maybe not all of them, but certainly some of them were Jewish. Yes, it was a strong, vibrant German Jewish culture. You know, obviously the Nazis tried to expunge the Jewish element, but some of Heine's work was so popular, like the Lorelei, the poem which I kind of reference here, so popular that they couldn't get rid of the poem, so they claimed it was anonymous. That was the nearest they could get to expunging Heine.
Rewriting history, isn't it?
Yes.
That sort of thing, and that's the thing, isn't it, with you know, the Nazis trying to extinguish Jewish life. Somehow, fortunately, they didn't manage to do that. The culture also lives on, and while
and it was the making of Hollywood, I suppose, as well.
It's making, yes. Well, I suppose that really started a good bit before that, but thank goodness the culture lives on and families live on as well. Talking of families, I think the next poem came about because of your son moving. And I think, you know, I've certainly noticed that language, culture, and Jewish history are all explored richly in your work. And in this poem, we move to Spain, don't we? And perhaps you'd like to tell us a bit about the next poem.
Yes, so my son went to Madrid, where he lives now, and I think in a couple of years he will be a Spanish citizen. He's certainly aiming for that, and partly with a view to being able to visit him, speak to his friends, and that sort of thing. Order food in restaurants. I started learning Spanish, but I also got interested in the history of the Jews of Spain. I come from an Ashkenazi background, but I learned more about the Sephardic Jews and the events of 1492, which of course, when, you know, nearly 450 years before the Holocaust, something rather nasty happened to the Sephardic Jews, and that I sort of drew parallels and found that of great interest, and another very moving part of Jewish history.
Just to set this poem up, I think, am I right in thinking that the point of view shifts at one point in the poem?
Yes, I mean it started. It starts with an anecdote, and I think I may maybe make it easier if people understand this is in the voice of a young Spanish woman who's been working in London, and it's about her experience. I wrote that poem, and in fact, my son suggested, who's a sort of a harsh but significant critic of my poetry. He said, there's something missing from that, and what's missing is your own kind of emotional reaction to the story. So I put in a second section which deals more with that. El impacto del olvido, the impact of forgetting. 92, a great year, 92. Columbus set out for the West. We took Granada from the Moors. And though it was done in a dubious way, maybe it's good we've no Jews today. They mostly converted or left, so I'm told, in 1492. They're digging in my pueblo. My granny says it's best to leave the dead just where they are, to let them be, to let them rest. Always remember, she used to say. Remember, it's best to forget. 92. my granny's now, a great age, 92. She was just a girl when all those people were killed in our pueblo. She didn't say much, just forget. I couldn't find a job in Spain. You've got to travel on. I'm doing lots of different jobs until it's good back home. Once, cleaning in a London house. One Friday in the dusk, my boss, she set the table and she lit some candles too. You have that funny custom here. We have that back at home. My granny lights a candle just every Friday night. She does it in a cupboard though. It's something which she can't explain. 2. El Impacto. This strange suburban story, why does it move me so? Hot November, Casa de Sefarad, Córdoba. Why, when the black-bearded guide sings the songs of a Jewish girl in Ladino and the tongues of every foreign sailor who used her in those days in Salonika, why do I start to cry? I was not with the partisans in the forests of Lithuania, the Vilna refugees, singing all their words for a gun, Speyer, Nagan, Pistoil, in Desperanto Yiddish of the camps. I have no memories, nor pain, and the sweet ache which comes down the generations is this fond yearning for the worlds which used to be, before came 1492, before came 1943.
Thank you. And it's interesting that you use another voice there. Do you like writing in the first person as another person, as another character? Is that something you do a lot?
I think it's often said that the voice of a poem is not necessarily the author's voice, but I think in this case, the second part of that poem is the author's voice. But certainly, I think part of writing is to empathize and to sort of think yourself into the mind of another person as well.
Moving to a slightly different source of inspiration, and that's life events. They're often the trigger for creativity. And in March 2020, we all found ourselves affected by a change to our lifestyle. Your next poem brings that period sharply into focus. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? Of course, what I'm alluding to is COVID and the beginning of the first lockdown.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a poem about my last live event before lockdown and my first Zoom event. And it was a very strange time. But my last live event before lockdown was a workshop on Yiddish song, which was offered by Sasha Luria, a wonderful singer of a Yiddish song, who led a workshop in the sukkah of the Edinburgh Shul, the Edinburgh Hebrew congregation. And it was a strange event where we sort of sat as separate as we could, and we washed our hands singing happy birthday and all that stuff. But we did a live workshop, and it was a wonderful workshop. And then the next day she was supposed to do something else, but it was cancelled. And she took refuge in Fife, in the home of Michael Alpert, another a klezmer musician and multi-instrumentalist who lives in the East Nook of Fife. And through the good offices of Skojec, there was a wonderful Zoom event which was sort of broadcast out of Michael Alpert's home in the East Nook of Fife with Michael Alpert and Sasha Luria. It was a really wonderful event and a huge attendance because, you know, unlike now, there was some novelty in Zoom literary and musical events. This poem is written in a sort of Yiddish or Yinglish, but I also have the English version. what I'll do is I'll read the Yiddish and of each. There's 3 stanzas. I'll read the Yiddish, then the English, then back to the Yiddish. Singing with Sasha in the shul in Sheens, singing in the sukkah. Mein Herz weint in mir. Es ist mir nicht gut. Ay, yabba baba boy. Singing with Sasha in the synagogue in Sheens, singing in the tabernacle. My heart weeps within me. I feel so wretched. Ay, yabba baba boy. Es brennt, Schwesterle. Unsere große Welt brennt. Oi, just last week you taught us a Liedl. Und euch spielen das Liedl können wir nicht. Es ist mir nicht gut. Ay, yabba baba boy. It's burning, little sister. Our big world's burning. Oi, just last week you taught us a song. Now there's no way to play it out. And I'm so wretched. Ay, yabba baba boy. Van deinen Städtler in Eastneuch Pfeifele, wirst zoomen schon this week zu mir und singst zu mir on consonants. Es ist mir schon gut. Ay, yabba baba boy. From your little village in the East Nook of Fife, you'll zoom to me this week and sing to me on consonants. Already I feel better. Ay, yabba baba boy.
Thank you.
I think there's some interesting things to say about this. I think, let me start with the East Neuch Pfeifele. This arises from a conversation with my mum at the time I was writing the poem, or even just telling her about the Zoom event. And I said, I've been to this wonderful Zoom event from the East Nook of Fife. And my mother said, what is this East Neuch Pfeifele? So I thought, right, got to go in, got to go in a poem.
Yeah.
There are other more sort of literary type resonances to this. Es brennt, Schwesterle references Mordecai Gebertig's famous poem Es brennt, Brüderle, Unser Städtel brennt, which dates back to the pogroms of the late 1930s. And there's also a bit of a folk song, Oi Dorten, Dorten, in the line, Neu spielen das Liedl können wir nicht. Neu spielen das Liedl können wir nicht, which is my transformation of a line from that folk song. I've changed it, obviously. So there's bits of Yiddish poetry and song sort of resonating here as well.
And do you think that Yiddish, the way people use Yiddishes, also picks up on local dialects just naturally? I mean, do you find that there are variations in Yiddish because of where people live and come from?
There are, and I referenced that in the Auf Wiedersehen poem. The 3 words that the partisans in the forests of Lithuania used for a gun. They came from different dialects of Yiddish, but in the camps, in the concentration camps, there was a mixture of these dialects, and that's why I've described it as a sort of Desperanto Yiddish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are various variations of Yiddish in Eastern Europe, aren't there? But I was just wondering if, naturally, if you speak Yiddish, or some Yiddish and you live in Scotland or Glasgow, are there Glasgowisms or something that come into your pronunciation of Yiddish?
I wouldn't claim to have more than a smattering of Yiddish, to be honest with you, but certainly there are differences in the pronunciation, and I can tell that the way that my family well, I come from a mixed marriage of Litvak and Galiciana, so there were probably different pronunciations of Yiddish, but certainly there were differences. And yeah, there was some. There's a word that I'm dredging my memory now, but there was a word ongeschnosket, which we always used to talk about when my mother at Pesach would get a little bit drunk on the Passover wine, and the word for that was she was ongeschnosket. And it seems possibly that the word ongeschnosket is a sort of South African South African Yiddish, bizarrely.
That's interesting. It's how the language changes and is reshaped, perhaps depending on where people live. And talking about where people live, um, I know that you told me that where you now live is very special to you. And just going back to lockdown, I think we all had to live more curtailed existences. Online and on radio and television brought us in contact with the wider world. Um, but we were very much confined to our own immediate surroundings. And your next poem is very much based on about the place that you live. And in fact, you've written a whole pamphlet of poems inspired by where you live, which is Cramond.
Maybe at this point, Janet can flash up the slides
Of the books of
of the books,
Yeah.
and this is partly so that those who are finding this on YouTube will have the opportunity to go onto my website there, and you'll see that there is a discount code. Spring 23 for the Kilt of Many Colours. I've been reading from the Kilt of Many Colours so far, and this is the other book which I'm about to read from, this is the Cramond one. What I have experienced, I suppose, as a very lucky kind of immigrant to Scotland, who's felt very welcome here and been very settled here, is you can become very fond of a place where you have become rooted rather than where your roots are, shall we say. Diaspora dream. So rooted here I am become a tree, washed in on flames of choice the wind has fanned, like all the others looking out to sea. Though not a son of this community, I grow around your railings, here I stand, so rooted here I am become a tree. Another stripe in your geology, a layer in the rock, a sandstone band, like all the others looking back to sea. A fine example, 1953. You count my rings and try to understand why, rooted here, I am become a tree. I am grown tall and tied, yet landing free. Your breeze, my branches shape a wishing sound, like all the others looking out to sea. And in this dream you make a bench of me to sit while children dabble in the sand. So rooted here I am become a tree, like all the others looking out to sea.
Thank you. So Cramond is very special, and it constantly inspires you, it seems.
Yes, and I think especially during lockdown, we were very fortunate in being able to walk out of the door and down the river to the sea. And even in the depths of winter, to gather plenty of light. There is just so much light when you're down at the sea and you have the sky. And even, on the shortest day of the year, you can get a lot of light.
So, you really enjoy exploring language, and the next poem you're going to read is a mixture of Scots and Yiddish, and it came about because of a challenge or a request from another poet.
Yes, so the Gaelic poet Marcus Machan Turner, I say Gaelic, he's actually from Yorkshire, but one of the things about language is that you can learn it as well as you can learn it as an adult as well as from your mother. Anyway, Marcus asked me to translate a poem of his into Scots Yiddish. Marcus had been quite moved by visiting the former Jewish quarter of Edinburgh in sort of the Sheens area on the south side, and especially the Jewish burial ground at Sheens House Place, which is a pocket handkerchief size cemetery, but very moving if you ever have a chance to visit it. So Marcus has produced, I think we can screen share the cover of his book Polaris, which is a rather wonderful book that he composed during lockdown. It's coming yet. There it is, with great deal of exploration of culture of the islands, shall we say, and what Marcus refers to as minoritized languages. So he asked me to translate his poem from Gaelic, and that was a challenge because I don't know any Gaelic, and Scots Yiddish is a language which it's not really a living language, but I managed somehow to put something together. So I think without further ado, I should start reading it. Spuren van Sprachen, Shalom Aleichem, Vrede Gaelic Marcus McIntyre. Ath Adam Street was eens gevierd zu anderen gas, ne spore use waar davend hier, but ainly rammel van de wand, o Annelie, met brennende reute vlammen raising, among die stenen van die gegend. In these parts were used eens habbenlit de connels ebige licht.
Shall we show people what that looks like on the
Oh
page?
yes, let's have it screen shared.
There we go.
So that's what I've just been reading, and so I'll just mention the thing about Scots and Yiddish is that well, it goes back to Sasha Luria's phrase, which I borrowed of Yiddish sings on the consonants, and so does Scots, and the two languages have a very they share a common sound world, a common music, and especially that that ch sound in words like loch at the back of the throat. So they do go very nicely together, and sometimes you can't be quite sure whether a word is Scots or Yiddish, and so that does lend itself to this kind of strange, largely reimagined language. But I hope that people don't worry too much about the meaning of individual words and just get the sense of the sound. You may get it. Shall I continue, and then I could read it in English if there's time?
Well, yes. Well, let's show the next two verses.
Yes.
And just have a look at this and see what you make of it, and then David, if you would read it the way it's written here.
Okay. Along the Pleasance, diagonal Durchschnitt Teschines we hovered, wo alle Menschen, Rebbe, Trebler, Bubele, Takrest. Jingle strenkelt o'er the gran. Some souls, maybe your ain kindskinder, he stilled nae funeral can but chuckies, wo Bobbies rustaf o'er their leersteins. Der schwarze Jet, lock fast vermacht. We couldna read your names and mitzvot, or skrived in alphabet, by Palestina. Hebräisch gain, die Mamaloschen euch, it's all los, but here, your graveyard, I noch Friedrich, behalten unter Frühlings Nissan gloamin, they crowds can bringe into your stumme minion.
Thank you. This is lovely to listen to as well, even if you don't understand all of it. So let's hear the English now. If you
okay, so I'm reading now Marcus's own translation. So Marcus provides in his book, he provides his original Gaelic version, an English translation, and my Scots Yiddish version. Hebrew Traces, in memory of the first Hebrew congregation in Edinburgh. In an Adam Street cul-de-sac, no trace of the origins of your worship, but the ruins of a singular wall, a flame of sable brick rising amongst the rocks of the region, near the site where you held the taper to the eternal flame. Up the Pleasance, cutting diagonally into the Sheens, we paused by your congregation's first place of repose, shingle strewn across the ground, some soul, your own descendants perhaps, had in your memory placed pebbles where coins now rust upon the headstones. The black gate locked, we could not enter to read your names and blessings, etched in Hebrew lettering upon the burial slabs. A language lost to this capital, its peoples, but your cemetery, ever peaceful, concealed under the Nisan gloaming, your prayers undisturbed by the multitudes.
Thanks very much. And that poem's not your version of that poem. Is it published anywhere?
Yes, well, my version is there in Polaris.
Oh, right, it is.
Yes.
Yes, I wasn't clear on
So
that.
Marcus, what Marcus has done is a rather wonderful thing, which is he's got people translating his work into a variety of languages, including things like Cornish, well, Welsh, obviously. So it's a multilingual
Publication.
fest, really. You know, it's wonderful.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Well, talking of the mixture of languages, I don't know about everybody else, but often when you buy flat pack furniture or a gadget that you need to put together, you get very basic instructions, sometimes no instructions, just diagrams, or sometimes you get the instructions in lots of different languages. And I think this has been the inspiration for your next poem.
So, I mean, this started with my Spanish teachers, Ruben and Veronica, when they told me that they'd met when they were both working in a branch of a well-known Swedish self-assembly store that I won't mention in the south of Madrid, and in 2005. And I thought, what a wonderful, interesting place for a romance. And it was crying out for a poem. So in due course, the poem itself has become a flat pack poem. And I'll just illustrate what I mean by that, because it folds into a wheezine, what I call a wheezine. So this is self-published as a Riso printed wheezine, single poem pamphlet. The poem itself has been commended in the Cafe Writers competition, but I'll read it just now. Your Swedish flat pack love kit. He waited in the dark in a cold, hard box, worked his way to the top of the pile, couldn't see a way to get it together, though all the instructions were at hand. She'd been looking for something suitable, meandered the set path by the meatballs through a crush of Swedish consonants, until she found consonants taking him home in the boot. Laid out on the bed in her flat, his coat stripped off with a Stanley knife, she counted his panels and pins, dowels and glue, 3 sizes of screw, and set 2 with the Allen key. She held him now, fully assembled, sat down, resting her arms on his, content in herself and supported, and he at last hers completely, and only the best of himself. They opened the next box together. The parts were all there, but this time, while looking for the missing manual, a flimsy sticker fell out reading, Lycka till med den här saken. Good luck with this thing. So, and away they go in the car. So apologies for my Swedish pronunciation, but I can't resist putting a language in, even if it's a language I really don't know at all.
Tack så mycket, which I think is thank you very much in Swedish, but I could be wrong.
Merci mucho, which is the only thing I know of Ladina.
Very good. So we began with some memories from your childhood, and I think the next poem, or the next couple of poems that you want to read, go back to childhood or even for children.
Yes, so I now have a couple of granddaughters, and it's kind of encouraged me to take an interest in writing poetry for children. These are a couple of examples. One is a little bit more serious. I'll start with the more serious one and then the humorous one. Sad rags. Grandad used to wear it, so I'm told, a wobbly old web of useless holes. All the other clothes know it won't keep out the cold. If it went to a charity shop, it would remain unsold. Can you blame a string vest for being depressed? All cozy, nice and dry, not a cloud in the pram or the sky, until orange rains out of the blue, closely followed by one number 2, and then at the end of a damp, dingy day, all night in a bin, tied up tight, tossed away. If I were baby's nappy, I too would be unhappy. These twins are always distanced. They're not allowed to meet. They see each other passing as I kick them down the street. I treat them rough, I scrape and scuff, and though it's tough, they can't refuse. Pity my shoes, who didn't choose these weary walking blues. Soiled and stained where she got soaked, coming over in the boat. My younger brother got the coat, and now my hoodie's part of me. 1,000 miles by land, by sea. She can't forget the bangs and flashes. You call her a rag, but she's my fleece. We're worn and torn, and all we want is peace. I realized as I was reading that I'd said this was a serious poem, and it only gets serious in the last stanza.
I think the next one, Cold Kale and Custard.
Yes, so this is a poem in Scots, and one regular feature of my poetry is that I'm very rude about my mum's cooking. My mum, I was going to say is a terrible cook. She certainly was a terrible cook when I was growing up, and that provides plenty of material for poetry. She does have a sense of humor. She's able to laugh at herself. But this is not really about my mum's cooking specifically. It's anyway, I'll read it. Cold kale and custard. Cold kale and custard, granny's awfully flustered. Stovies new in bramble stew. Dinna ken what I can do. I'm fit to bulk. I'm no that wheel. She's biling mince wi' apple peel. Tat is next champer in Geely. Hod you wish, she's 93.
Very good.
This is published on a website called The Dirigible Balloon, which has now got hundreds, if not thousands, of poems for children. Some of them with voice recordings. In the voice recording, the 2 voices in that poem, the child's voice is in my voice, but the parent saying "Hod you wish she's 93" is done in an authentic Glaswegian voice by my wife. So that can be heard in a better production, I think.
Very nice, lovely. Have we got time for one more?
This is one which is recently published in Poetry News, the Poetry Society publication Poetry News, and it's a sort of an Edinburgh ghost poem with a difference. It's a sort of ghost pub crawl between Ryerie's Bar and the Diggers, which anybody who knows Edinburgh hostelries will know these establishments. And this is based initially on memories. Such presences. The ghosts are getting rat-assed in Ryerie's, slicing real furrows in imaginary ice. The HR director sits in the lap of a union lawyer as they celebrate closing a factory with no redundancies. Now Ryerie's is refurbished, glows in the glaze of Haymarket redone. A new tram rounds the old bend, and the ghosts go on drinking in that loft in my head where a wonky light's flickering. Every street in yesteryear, pale phantoms of brass plates. That pub, my office block, our cafe going by another name, is frosted by lost promises, cold coffees, rings on beer mats. I'd skate, arms folded on the loch, but rubbing rime from clouded panes, I glimpsed the ghosts roll down the Dalrye Road and slide, pie-eyed, on overcoats of pine up Coffin Lane to clinch the deal for 80 shillings at the Diggers. A barmaid clears my glass. I rise. I need some freezing air. Step out. The night breath reeks of hoary snows, where good ghosts sledge their lives away again, impaled on rusty railings. I am slipping. Got to get a grip.
Thank you very much. And where did you say that was published? That poem?
The Poetry News, which is one of the publications of the Poetry Society. They had a competition on the topic of hauntings, and this one was playing in my mind. It started off, I mean, I could talk forever about this poem, but it started off as being only about the incident that I remembered from an actual event at Ryries many years ago. And I took it along to perform it at a kind of party, a poetry party at the Diggers. And on my way walking to the Diggers, I passed Coffin Lane, which I crossed before. And so it sort of cried out for me to turn it into a pub crawl ghost poem in which they come up Coffin Lane to the Diggers.
Very good, very good. Lots of Edinburgh references in there for people to spot.
Yes.
David, thanks very much. It's been lovely hearing your poems and hearing the background and hearing your life and your journeys. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been most enjoyable talking about, being able to talk a bit about the background to the poems, which isn't on the surface of the poems, if you know what I mean.
Thank you.